our name is Patricia Powell and Victoria Ruby. We're going to start with a group definition about what Creole culture is. Who are they? The Creole culture is non-Anglo-Saxon culture and lifestyle that flourished in Louisiana before it was sold to the United States in the 80s, and that continued to dominate South Louisiana until the early decades. The Creole are located at many parts of Louisiana, but there also are people mixed French, African, Spanish, and Native American ancestry. An extraordinary Creole culture rich in traditions around food, literature, music, and more tribes in the New Orleans. Today, this culture is very diversified, and we can see in Louisiana, many parts of Louisiana, they are located in that part, like some parish like Jefferson Parish, Lafayette Parish, Louisiana Parish, New Orleans Parish, California, and all other states like Texas also. They are native speakers, are around 10,000 native speakers in Louisiana, and their first language or their native language is Creole, French Creole, or Louisiana Creole. Today, someone who self-identifies as Creole in New Orleans is likely to be a person of mixed racial ancestry with deep local roots and with family members who are Catholic and probably have French surnames. Many Black Creoles live in Darien and near the 7th Ward, not too far from the historic Creole areas around the French Quarter. While some Creole cultural traits continue today, in other words, the phrase that like many festivals like Mardi Gras, festivities, and other aspects such as the French language have largely disappeared. Yet thousands of older New Orleans, be they white or black, can recall elders who spoke some French well into the 20th century, and most of them will have to themselves, they say that they are Creoles.
Group and cultural differences.
Yeah, we can see that cultural differences, they are so different. Creole are different than Cajun. We're going to explain after that, but we can see in this part of the presentation that Creole food is a blend of various cultures that found their way to Louisiana, including French, Spanish, Acadian, Caribbean, West African, German, and Native American, among others. We can see one other favorite, other famous dish are jambalaya, the gumbo, oyster, like Rockefeller styles, and other kind of soups and desserts that they use that specific flavor that the Creole style gives. Historically, Creole was not a racial signifier, but rather partial or based where are they located. Many Creole are established in this state, mostly in New Orleans, as we see before, and also Creole also has a lot of famous in Creole cuisine. For example, the Creole tomatoes, the Creole festivals, the Creole the Creole way of they cook the food are really significant and different. We have here in New Orleans many restaurants with this kind of flavor and a specific flavor that is the Creole food. And also we can see many other traditions in the next slide. We can see some traditions and more of them. We can see some architecture like some houses in the French Quarter in uptown of New Orleans. Also, we can see some places so built. They are built in that kind of French styles that come from the Creole style. In modern Louisiana, which of the Creole culture is centered around the city of New Orleans. In fact, the strong Creole culture of this city is one of the big drawing cards for tourists and is evident at everything from local restaurants and bars to the famous parades that line the street during the Mardi Gras celebration. This celebration, the Mardi Gras, is original from the Creole culture. They celebrate their ancestors, and they are that kind of celebration is continual doing every year. So this is one of the strongest of this culture because their tradition have been remembered every year, and they remain in that modern culture. Also, the architecture of Louisiana is also heavily influenced by the French and Spanish settlers that helped to create the Creole culture. We can see many houses and many builds, with this kind of aspect. They look like French style, and that come from the Creole culture when the French came for first time to this state. Also, some values of this culture are the Afro-Creoles attempted to emulate the same values of the more elite community. The Creoles, therefore, their communities held the same values, which helped them draw closer together. They are very unique. Both cultures place the importance of property and family. Not surprisingly, early marriage was expected and celebrated for Creole women. They trying to remain the value of the family, and they really appreciate what is the marriage. They are focuses, and the woman needs to wait, because it's not about how young the woman is. It's about how the woman or the man in other case are ready to have a marriage, and that marriage they have the responsibility to remain that, to protect that marriage, in order to have a long family, and to have a good family for the culture. Another aspect of them, we can realize, is about the language. The language, also both the Creoles and the Afro-Creoles incorporate the French language into their dialect. There are subtitles of difference between the two dialects. The Creoles speak standard French, which is spoken by the descendants of the French upper classes and around the New Orleans. This is different from the Afro-Creoles who speak Louisiana Creole. Louisiana Creole is a blend of various languages like English, French, and possible African or Spanish. Creole Louisiana culture is really determined by social status, where rural life conforms to rigid disciplines, where human bondage creates wealth, where that they can adherence to the family business and tradition was in this culture, where women run business and own properties, where democratic ideals and individualism were held to contempt, and were until the 20th centuries in this kind of culture. The Creole experience in Louisiana is a close cousin to Creole cultures worldwide. The nearest examples are found in the Caribbean, Cuba, Haiti, Martinique, the Indian Oceans, and Brazil in South America. All these places have similar ethnic mixtures, strong links in cuisine, architecture, music, folklore, lifestyle, religion, family, values, and colonial economics. But Louisiana is just one small member of this Creole family that stretches across of the globe, but is the only part found in the United States, of America. Also, we can see in the Creole culture many aspects that they can be really different, and through the history they have been remain with the culture. They protect the culture. And then we can see the next slide.
I'm going to discuss a shift in the atmosphere, the change to the Creole culture in New Orleans. So as Victoria stated before, Creole at the beginning, up until a certain point of time, identified a group of people, and it wasn't synonymous with a race or a specific like phenotype or black or white. It was for a group of people who were considered indigenous to the area. But soon after the Civil War, that changed. So after the Civil War, we began to see what we now recognize as Creoles, which is Creole people of color. Um, Creole people of color had special privileges. They weren't considered regular Black people for once. The Code of New York of 1724 gave Creole people the same rights that regular free citizens got. So at that time, the code established that a Creole man of color would have the same rights and citizenship as a white man that was free. So Creole people of color could also own land and receive formal education, which was not common for Black people at all, especially enslaved people. They weren't even allowed to read. Creole people of color often owned slaves, and a good example of that would be the infamous story of the Melrose Plantation. The Melrose Plantation is a plantation off of Cane River, and what's pictured is the owner and his wife. The owner was a free white man, and the wife is um, a seventh generation slave, I want to say. They had mixed children, or children that are considered Creole, and the slave plantation is like a big heritage for Creole people, arts, and music. Creole people at the time were also allowed to hold political offices, and they were somewhat romanticized in society because Creole people represented the best of both worlds. So they had the whites' power and privilege, and then they had the looks of African Americans and all of that thing. And then Creoles had a status significant for people of color. They were considered proper, civil, etc. So Creoles often looked down on Black people because they felt like they were better than them. It was a sort of like an inferiority, superiority type thing. Creoles considered themselves superior to regular Black people because they could read, they were free, they were given all these rights. They did have these privileges, and they fit into these white spaces due to their ethnic, background. So compare and contrast the difference between Creole and Cajun. I always thought they were the same, but they are not the same because, like I said, after the Civil War, white Creoles and colors no longer shared the same social status and identity. After the Civil War, segregation became a part of the American culture, specifically in New Orleans, and that created a distinct difference between the two groups. White Creoles kept their identity by assimilating into Cajun culture, which is like French people that came to America but were not indigenous to America. And so that's why now we recognize Creole, or the common conception is that Creoles represent Black people and Cajuns represent white or European people from French descent. Facing oppression from whites and or other Europeans. So a major shift happened after Reconstruction, which is after the Civil War. In 1862, New Orleans got invaded and was conquered by the American Army. And basically, what happened was the American Army and the people that came brought their ideologies with them. So while in New Orleans, as a French colony, or post or prior to the Civil War, African Americans and whites could, assimilate in the same culture because, like like I said, Creole people of color were not considered regular African Americans or regular Negroes. So they had these luxuries to be in white spaces. They could go wherever they want. They could move freely because they were considered just regular citizens. Once once New Orleans got invaded, And after the Civil War, we began to see things like segregation come along, and that completely shakes up the atmosphere that the Creole people were experiencing. So white Creoles and Creoles of color had to separate. White passing becomes popular at the time. So if you were Creole and of color, and let's say you had straighter hair or fairer skin, you were able to white pass to get into these spaces now. So basically, these people of color would pretend to be white so they can get into these areas, and it would be like unbeknownst to even recognize their blackness because they didn't want to lose their popularity and status. In 1890, segregation becomes legal in Louisiana, and that is evident by the creation of the Separate Car Act, which is pictured right here, where the streetcars in New Orleans were no longer for, like, you get in where you fit in. Black people had to go to one side or to the back, and then white people had to go to the front. And a good point to talk about this oppression would be Plessy versus Ferguson, which we all know is a Supreme Court ruling. But the case is actually interesting when you look at it from a perspective of Creole culture. So Plessy was a self-identifying Creole man, and he was able to white pass. But once the segregation came about and the Separate Car Act came about, he wasn't willing to give up his white privilege so easily. And so he fought, and the case went through several circuits of court, and then it went to the Supreme Court, and they upheld the decision. And I think it's interesting to note that we are often taught that Plessy versus Ferguson was about like racial inequality, but that's not necessarily the case. Plessy's whole argument was that due to his Creole background and his Creole roots and the mixes of like certain ethnicities to make him and people like him, that they could arguably claim their whiteness because according to old laws, they technically had the rights of white men. Creoles also faced oppression from Black people or other people of color, Negroes at the time. So the sign says Creoles not welcome is due to their history. And like I said, their inability to accept their Blackness, they often frowned upon Black people. So as a result, Black people started to have negative attitudes towards Creoles. So what happens when they get forced out of these white spaces is that they try to come and assimilate into Black spaces, but Black people and regular people of color aren't necessarily welcoming to them. Creoles of color thought they were superior for a long time, and Negroes did not want to unite with them. A writer says the Creoles and mulattoes generally thought of themselves to not only be different, but also be superior from Blacks who had more heavily pigmented skin tones. Offensive terms like mulatto, mixed breed, half and half were then becoming popular to describe Creoles by both Blacks and whites. And then Creoles still kept this like pseudo superiority about themselves, even to the fact that they created physical boundaries between them and regular Black people. So they lived in spaces where it was considered Creole only, and it was far away from Blacks, but close enough to whites so they could directly distinguish that they are not the same. Resistance. So Creole people have always practiced activism and resistance, especially during the segregation era in New Orleans. This is a paper called The Daily Crusader, which is a paper specifically for Creole people to talk about where they would fit in this newfound binary society. So if they weren't white, if they weren't considered white anymore, and then they don't want to be considered Black, where do they stand? Creoles fought to maintain their status as legally white and strategically moved to keep their power, status, and privilege. So as stated before, the whole Plessy versus Ferguson case, them separating themselves from Black by living in certain parts of town that Black people weren't able to live in, all those things. And it created this concept of a phenotype, even though, people look like one thing, they're not necessarily considered that. So because a lot of these people did look white and they did share European like hair, eye color, skins, or things that are more common towards European. With this new passage of the segregation laws, they no longer fit in. So it created this whole dialect of like, just because you look a certain way, that doesn't mean you are a certain way or things aren't as what they perceive. I did not find any protections against for Creole people, specifically any legal protections, but I did find a lot of activism in the community itself. So them trying to ensure that their roots don't die off, their culture doesn't die off, them reclaiming certain things. So Creole, French, a lot of people, specifically people that are of the younger generation, are noticing that the language is dying out and there's a need to teach it. There are people on Instagram who create podcasts and webinars to teach people how to speak Creole French. And then there are also other things, news articles and stuff about Creole culture in reference to Mardi Gras, like Victoria stated, and how it's important to protect those things. So while there may not be legal, while there may not be legal protections, they are doing stuff to make sure they're protected in a less organized way, I want to say. And that's pretty much it. These are our references. And thank you.